Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the launch of the review of Maritime Transport 2024 by UNCTAD and Development. As you know, this report is a key reference for anyone concerned with global trade and its future in the face, especially of current disruptions, which UNCTAD has been covering over the past period, especially the importance of maritime transport in sustaining global trade, particularly for developing countries according to UNCTAD's mandate. With us today, we have Ms. Shamika Sirimanne. She's Director of UNCTAD's Division on Technology and Logistics. And we have also our colleague Jan Hoffmann, who was lead on the maritime transport he's been doing for many, many years now. Navigating Maritime Chokepoints is this year's title, touching on key issues that matter to all of us: trade, development, and resilience in the face of new challenges. Ms. Sirimanne will take us through these findings, highlighting the importance of maritime trade as a lifeline for economies, especially in vulnerable regions. Afterwards, we will open the floor for questions from both the room and for those connected online to either the director or, of course, to our colleague Jan Hoffmann. Thank you very much, dear director. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marcelo. And good day to all of you who are here. Good afternoon, and joining from elsewhere. A good day to all of you. So let me put to you 3 key points. First is the macroeconomic outlook on maritime trade. We expect a modest 2% growth for 2024, driven by demand for bulk commodities like iron ore, coal, and grain, and also as a result of container trade picking up from basically an abysmal growth of 0.3% in 2023 to a robust growth of 3.5% in 2024. Now, this projection for 2024 is very much in line with the trends in the world economy: stable, slow, and resilient global growth predicted at around 3.2%, 3.4% for this year, and some easing of inflationary pressures in major economies. Now, going forward, we project maritime trade to grow at an average annual rate of 2.4% in the medium term. This is between 2025 and 2029. And containerized trade to increase by 2.7% in the medium term. Now, we believe that this growth to be supported by technological advancements, the transition to cleaner energy, and renewed interest in investing in maritime and trade infrastructure. I'm talking about there's a lot of interest in smart and green ports and improving hinterland connectivity and digitalization of processes, trade and transport processes. And here is the bad news. The downside risk loom high for this medium-term projection. You see, the geopolitical upheavals, unrelenting conflicts, and wars never bode well for international trade. Rising protectionism and the resultant trade restrictions are on the rise. Elections are taking place or have just taken place in some of the major economies around the world, so we have to watch out for the policy directions of incoming administrations. And many low-income countries are faced with rising debt burdens, elevated borrowing costs, and they are unable to face further external shocks. You see, when the future is uncertain, or the future is very uncertain, as consumers, what we do first is to tighten belts, and we don't spend. And investors go into the wait-and-see mode, and as a result, economies suffer and international trade with it. So in essence, the downside risk for the medium-term projections are very high. Now, my second point, and also the theme of the report, about the maritime choke points. These maritime choke points in several places have been acting up. The result is significant pressure on global logistics and strained supply chains. The question is this the new normal? And if it's the new normal, what do we do? How do we prepare? Now, I think many of you know maritime choke points are critical points along transport routes with limited alternative routes. Take the Suez Canal, for example. About 10% of world maritime trade by volume and 22% of containerized trade cross the Suez Canal annually. Now, the traffic through the Panama and Suez Canals dropped by over 50% by mid-2024 compared to their peaks in late 2023. Like the mid-2023, they had peaks, and compared to that, mid-2024, 50% drop. Climate-induced low water levels in the Panama Canal on the one hand, and the outbreak of conflict in the Red Sea region and affecting the Suez Canal. For example, I think we have said in our report, cargo rerouting around Africa surged massively, with ship capacity arrivals increasing by almost 90%. Now, the result of all this, choke points acting up, is longer routes, port congestion, higher fuel consumption, higher wages of crew, higher freight rates, and rising insurance premiums, and the list goes on. So let me focus on a couple of those things. Maritime trade in ton miles is on the rise. I think we have charts in our reports. Look at the page 2 of the overview. We have a figure showing that this ton miles trade is up. But by mid-2024, rerouting vessels had increased container ship demand by 12%. This is mostly due to the Red Sea situation. And by mid-2024, container freight rates more than doubled compared to the end 2023. And also Red Sea disruption has had significant impact on container rates. While rates have gone down in recent months, they are far above the rates observed prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, and this is a very big concern. And most importantly, high and volatile freight rates and the uncertainty they bring to the cost of doing business are a significant deterrent for international trade. And the small traders and developing countries are the most affected. So anything to do with high and volatile, anything is not good. And then on congestion, the port hubs like Singapore, the major Mediterranean ports, those in Africa were under pressure, and also because of the demand for transshipment. And on emissions, they went up. We have an example in the press release saying that when diverting around Africa, instead of using the Suez Canal, a typical big container ship on the Far East Europe trade route adds $400,000 in emission cost per voyage. So that's the situation. Now, the third point. Who bears the cost? So when maritime choke points act up, small island developing states and least developed countries are hit the hardest in terms of rising price levels of food and other essential goods. And we have done calculations to show how hard they have been hit. Now, the small island developing states also rely heavily on shipping for essential imports, but their maritime connectivity has declined by 9% on average over the past decade, making their isolation more pronounced. And this is a concern. So what do we do? In our report, we put an enormous amount of emphasis to say building resilience to a wide-ranging disruptions is urgently needed, because we are in a disruption is the new normal. We have provided a specific set of recommendations. Let me give you a few of them. We say strengthen international cooperation and enhance monitoring systems to stabilize trade routes, provide early warning, and enable rapid, efficient rerouting of vessels. Diversify shipping routes and support regional trade initiatives to reduce dependency on long-distance routes and boost intra-regional trade flows. That's more resilient. Invest urgently in resilient infrastructure at key choke points to minimize the impact of climate risks and conflicts. Address the emerging new issues in the maritime landscape. For example, legal implications, as companies must now factor climate risks into shipping contracts to minimize losses and legal disputes and to keep trade flowing and insurance affordable. And in fact, we have a whole chapter dedicated on this topic of legal implications. So finally, the disruptions at the Suez and Panama canals highlight the fragility of global supply chains in the face of mounting climate and geopolitical risks. With global trade accounting for over 80% of seaborne transportation, ensuring the resilience of maritime infrastructure and accelerating the transition to low-carbon shipping are critical for maintaining the stability of global trade. So thank you so much. Over to you, Marcel.
Thank you for this overview. Again, the key assessments, the insights, and a bit of looking ahead in the context of vulnerability, uncertainty, and who pays the price. I think I have here from the floor here at the Palais, there's no questions, so we go directly over to online. I see here one hand raised to start with. Paula Dubras-Dobias, please. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much for that presentation. I'm sorry if I missed the first couple of minutes of the presentation, but I have two questions. First of all, with the issue of climate change, and I'm thinking about the impact on that it's had on the Panama Canal. I'm wondering if we can imagine in the future, near or further, potentially a closure of that route. And then secondly, I wanted to know, understand from your perspective how you see the efforts by the sector, freight and shipping sector, on transitioning away from the most polluting fuels that had been used in the past, how that's proceeding, if they're on schedule and so forth.
Thank you. So two questions. One, climate impact, example, Panama Canal, that we witnessed also with the Secretary General and with our colleague Jan Hoffmann here earlier in the year, and then low carbon maritime transport. Thank you.
I think the question you raised about the climate change is very, very pertinent. You see, what we have not seen, what we saw with the Panama Canal, it's the impact came so fast and so hard. And I don't think it was ever anticipated. Such a drought would come, the water levels would fall that far, and then, this would affect the global shipping. But I think this is the new normal. I think we will have to anticipate a lot more climate change-induced supply chain difficulties as we go forward, especially when these things happen in choke points. Then you basically everything come to a standstill. I think I will also get Jan, because Jan has been talking about the shipping sector and the decarbonization and done a lot of work. Let me give to Jan to address this issue. But I want to say one thing. I think we all need to decarbonize, every sector. That's the future. We are now talking about the climate change impact of all our lives. So this is something we have to do. But it also has to be done with due consideration given to developing countries, especially to low-income countries. They need to be supported to create new investments as we transition towards a low-carbon shipping or low-carbon world. I think, Jan, probably you would know more about the technicalities.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, thank you. On the two questions, also the one on the hypothetical question, what would happen if the Panama Canal were really 100% closed? In fact, on the differences between the two canals, Suez and Panama, there's some really novel, insightful research in our report. Please look at figures 5 and 7 from the overview. It's really worth it, where you see how different canals have different impacts on different sectors. And the Panama Canal, if it closes, you can still get containerized trade to the United States via the Pacific. Then you use the land bridge from Los Angeles to New York, or via Suez, if Suez is open. While for dry bulk, there are very little alternatives. So the dry bulk that goes through the Panama Canal has no alternatives. And we have seen with the current restrictions, so that's not hypothetical, it's hard data, the business that was most affected by the Panama Canal crisis were the dry bulk, the grains, coal, and so on trades. While the Suez Canal had a huge impact, especially on container freight rates. Yeah. So that is on that first question, hypothetical if it were to close down completely. I want to draw your attention also to a little update. So we have the review of Maritime Transport with our analysis. And with the kind help of Marcelo and team, and we have a data story where we have updated just for you until yesterday the very, very latest data, where we can show that the Panama Canal is actually recovering. It still faces challenges with the latest average, like 30 transits per day, which is 30% below its peak, but it is already 40% above the previous low point. While the Suez Canal is still today 57% below its peak and not above its low point. So there you see these different trends. On the second question of the decarbonization of the sector, yes, we have worked very intensively on this. Last year's review of Maritime Transport has a whole special chapter on it. Since we published last year's report, unfortunately, we realize emissions are still going up. Total emissions from shipping continue to increase, although they should be decreasing. Now, it depends a bit at what numbers you look at. If you look at the numbers, emissions per ton of cargo or per ton mile, we do see improvements. However, half of that improvement is just economies of scale. It's because ships get bigger, and would be a long story. We are not fans of ever bigger ships. They have other disadvantages on market concentration, on door-to-door costs, on infrastructure needs. So your question was a bit, are we on track or not? I dare say the International Maritime Organization and its members, they are on track with their objectives. They have advanced a lot with the negotiations of how to get there. They have not yet agreed, but we at UNCTAD have helped them to come to an agreement. And with the research we have done, some of it is in the review, it is quite clear to us that you need a combination of technical measures and economic measures. Shamika also referred to it. The economic measure, meaning some price on carbon, achieves two things. First, it makes the alternative fuels competitive. And secondly, it generates funding that can then be invested in the energy transition, especially in those that are most negatively affected, the small island developing states, least developed countries. Thanks.
Thank you, Jan. I'm not sure if you have more questions online. I can't see any virtual hands raised. Nous acceptons également les questions en français. We have interpretation here. If anybody online wishes to speak en français, en espagnol, Deutsch können wir auch anbieten ad hoc. I think there is no further questions. So just to wrap it up, if I may, dear colleagues, you underscore the critical vulnerability of maritime choke points, such as the Suez and the Panama canals. We remind you of our figure. These canals handle around 80% of the world's goods by volume, hence the importance. Addressing the vulnerabilities in maritime choke points is not just about trade. It's about safeguarding global food security as well, and energy supplies. Urgent resilience building is needed across the globe, the global maritime transport system particularly, and this was addressed as climate change has increasingly disrupted key shipping routes. And I take note that there are 2 more questions from online. Excellent. So we have one. I take them in the order as I see them. There are 3 more as they come, so it's good. First, the floor to Matt Coyne from TradeWinds. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah. In the report, it's mentioned sort of combating fraudulent ship registration. We talked a little bit about sort of all the issues sort of facing maritime transportation and how there are significant downside risks to the projections you've made. I guess I was just wondering. That you're concerned about these fraudulent ship registrations sort of suggests that you're aware of there's almost sort of becoming 2 tiers, at least in oil tanker trades. And could you speak at all maybe to the issues that a 2-tier shipping market could create, where there's like sort of a mainstream market and then a shadow fleet, and all the issues that come with that in attempting to build resilience and combat climate change, green shipping, all of that?
Yeah, thank you, TradeWinds. Thanks for a good question. UNCTAD collaborated again with the IMO and World Maritime University and IMLI in Malta on a study on the fraudulent ship registration. This, to some extent, it was nudged, or it was initiated because of current situation, but it's a long-term story. It is it's not something that has just appeared. We have always had situations where ships try to avoid regulations in general, not so much the sanctions, and then swap the flag. And this has become actually more difficult over the last years, decades. We do want to distinguish this from what you mentioned, the recent dark fleet or shadow fleet, which is to some extent made easier by quickly switching the flag and possibly to a fraudulent, like you register a flag and you claim I'm flying this flag, but actually you never really registered there. So to make the fraudulent registration more difficult, the IMO is working on an update of existing regulations and trying to enforce them more forcefully. And there, as I said, we have collaborated with them with a study, also with some statistics and some legal assessment. The dark fleet and shadow fleet, it's also about switching off your satellite system. It's really to be totally under the radar, and with or without fraudulent registration. So it's a bit to clarify, these are 2 separate things, but they are both quite important, and you have a quite detailed, good assessment, legal assessment of these, especially for the fraudulent ship registration issue in Chapter 5.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have another question online, 2 more for the time being. Nuran Erkul from the agency Anadolu, please. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity to ask. I would like to ask, with regards to who pays the price part, do you have any observation on how the increasing freight rates and the costs have reflected on the consumers in terms of goods price? And a second question on the rerouting to the Cape of Good Hope. Do you see that the rerouting could be kind of permanent given the continuing situation in the region? Thank you.
Let me start talking a bit about who pays for the rising freight rates. We done a quite an extensive simulation analysis to ask this question, and we find it's disproportionately is falling on small island developing states and on least developed countries. We find that they are hit hard by, the moment the freight rates go up, because they are depending on enormous amount of imports for their essential food and for energy and other essential goods. And moments the freight rate goes up, it then translates into increased consumer prices, and which then leads to inflationary pressures, and the biggest impacts are on these 2 groups. And in fact, we even had done calculations off to say how much the food prices would increase and how much the general inflation would rise. And so that's one thing. And the second thing is that, are we going to see the Cape of Good Hope as the rerouting point forever? I think when it started, there were a lot of issues of congestion, and then the ports unable to manage these flows of capacity coming their way. But we see now, there's a little less pressure. There's a little, learning by doing. But going through the entire through Cape of Good Hope also means long distances. It also means higher freight rates. It means high insurance. It means all sorts of high cost added to the wages. So again, the longer the routes, the higher the prices, and the burden will be again on consumers. And especially the consumers on small island developing countries and least developed countries who are depending on the ships to bring them food and essential medicine and essential goods to their shores. So this is a very big concern. I think, Jan, you want to add something?
Yeah, thank you. No, a very good question. Who pays the price? When we did our assessment on the long-term impact if we decarbonize shipping, and that leads to higher freight rates in the long term by 2040, by 2050. The normal standard assumption modeling is, we pay, the consumer pays. In the end, in competitive markets, at some point in time, it is passed on to the final client. So the consumer pays. However, we have to distinguish between who pays and who is impacted. Example, price of shipping bananas from Ecuador to Germany goes up. Price for banana goes up. My mother in Hamburg pays more for her bananas. So the consumer pays. Who will be impacted? The producer of bananas in Ecuador will still be impacted, because in the end, my mother will buy a bit fewer bananas from Ecuador and a little more apples from nearby, or bananas from Las Palmas. So I just want to clarify this. Who pays? Somebody, who is the one impacted, who is suffering? Even though the consumer pays, in the end, in the long term, and we do believe overall most shipping markets are competitive, but still also exporters, for example, from South America are impacted. In terms of the specific numbers, as Shamika rightly pointed out, we had done these assessments of how this impacts prices, and thank you also for this question. Already 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago actually it started, when Paul Krugman was still saying, do not worry about inflation during COVID. We already did a simulation at that time and said, well, if container freight rates go up by so and so much, we expect that global consumer prices will go up by 1.5 percentage points due to the higher freight rates during COVID. 6 months later, now 2.5 years ago, or like 6 months after we did that, the International Monetary Fund calculated, we have inflation, and they confirmed that 1.5 percentage point of that inflation at that time was due to higher prices. So with this experience, we are confident that our method is good because it was verified. This review of Maritime Transport, you will see that the more recent surge in freight rate, not quite as bad as during COVID, but also high. So you will see in chapter 3, I believe it is. So if the current crisis on the choke points continues and the freight rates continue to remain high, the consumer prices could rise by 0.6% by 2025 or by end of 25, I believe. So there's always a time lag. And the increase of prices for SIDS, small island states, is 50% bigger, 0.9%. So I hope that answers your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan.
Sorry. Apologies. Yeah, I forgot the second. I had to turn around my page. There was a question of the ships going around South Africa, and also Shamika alluded to this. Initially, the African ports were not ready for the surge, especially the huge container ships. They don't have cargo for Abidjan or for Durban or for Mombasa, but they may need to stop for repairs, for bunkering, and it just caused additional congestion. And we were asked, should African ports now invest in new capacities, in better hinterland connectivity to benefit from the additional ships? And it's really a very, very tricky question. If we knew the answer to your very good question, how long this will last, then we would say, yes, invest, it's an opportunity. But if you now invest, and in, we hope, not too many months, ships will again take the more efficient route, less costly, less CO2 emissions, faster, then this investment would have been done in vain. So can only confirm your good question.
Thank you, Jan. As you know, in economics, there's at least two perspectives to one single reality, if not many more. And we have two more questions online here posted via the chat. First from Justine Fontaine from Radio France Internationale. I'm going to read it out to you, colleagues. Can you elaborate on what are the concrete consequences for African countries of geopolitical issues in the Red Sea? It's a two-pronged question. Also, what perspectives do you see for 2024 regarding African countries? Again, so it's Africa with two focus, with two different perspectives. One, concrete consequences for African countries of the geopolitical issues in and around the Red Sea, and of course the perspectives for 2024, and I guess also for the immediate future in the new year. Thank you.
Let me start saying something, and then I think we have a whole piece that we developed for the continent. And I think, Jan, you can drag that one, bring that one. Let me say the consequences for African countries. A lot of African countries are small, open economies. They're not massive economies. There's only 10% of their GDP is in export and import trade. No. They are small, open economies, meaning they depend largely on international trade for their growth, for the competition, and also for their well-being, meaning imports coming their way, the food, the medicine, and so forth. So any kind of geopolitical situation that creates difficulties for supply chains, these countries get affected. And it's very simple. And they are at the brunt of any geopolitical upheavals that upend the international maritime trade, the supply chain situation, logistics situation. They affect African countries because they are small, open economies, most of them. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Very true. Two additional thoughts on this impact, especially in Africa. We did calculate what share of countries' trade normally goes through Suez. You have this in figure 1.7. So if I go by order of share, the biggest share, almost 34% of trade by volume of Sudan would normally go through Suez, that's our estimate, followed by Yemen, followed by Djibouti, followed by Saudi Arabia, followed by Seychelles. So those are the top 5 countries whose trade, just quantitatively, is most negatively affected by the limitations of going through Suez. Second, to complement, when you say Africa, we often may think just sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, Egypt itself, and also other northern African countries, especially in the eastern Mediterranean, are very negatively affected. Both now their own, Egypt first loses the income from its canal. Secondly, it loses the business of its transshipment port and the hub ports and the services. And thirdly, Egypt and other eastern Mediterranean countries, they are all of a sudden no longer at the center of routes that connect and may have a hub port and transshipment in Piraeus, in Malta, in Giorgio or in Egypt, but are all of a sudden at the end of a cul-de-sac. How do you say this in English? At the dead end. So the ships have to go the long way, and then they may transship in Morocco. So Tanger Med benefits from the situation, that's additional demand. Valencia, Barcelona. So there is some additional positive impact. And the third impact, Shamika already alluded to, if you have a global increase in freight costs, those countries that are more open, depend more on shipping, be they in Africa or be they in the Pacific, are the ones more negatively affected. Thanks.
Thank you. We have one more question also via chat from Iñaki Carrera from the Spanish digital newspaper El Mercantil. It's in relation to food security specifically, which we addressed before. And I'll read it out. In relation to food security, Ukraine has just asked the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, for help in curbing Russian attacks on grain-carrying merchant ships in the Black Sea. It is a fact that Russia has intensified its offensive against the port of Odessa and commercial vessels in the area. What solutions, and here comes the question against that backdrop, the journalist asks, what solution does UNCTAD propose to put an end to these attacks and to the food war waged by Russia to dominate African and less developed countries? Now, before passing the floor to our director, just let me remind everybody that UNCTAD's role is technical. The organization does not have a direct mandate, of course, to address military conflicts or even maritime security as such. Of course, we must focus on our expertise, which is in and around trade and development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I want to bring you back to what I said about the downside risk. When we talk about the 2025 and beyond, and I said the downside risks loom and very high. And want to emphasize geopolitical upheavals, unrelenting conflicts, and wars never bode well for international trade and maritime trade. So is the peace equal more trade? So that's what we would like to see. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. No, as Marcelo rightly pointed out, there are some aspects that are really more the mandate of the IMO, but I think we can proudly say that UNCTAD participated in the Global Crisis Group. Our Secretary General was, I believe, instrumental in certain solutions, the Black Sea, the Grain Initiative. So that requires collaboration between countries, between Ukraine, Russian Federation, Turkey, and the United Nations. So there's really not much we can add here, but based on our assessment analysis, let me share with you assessment we did already earlier when the war started, and now you could say, answering your question, when the war restarts, or we have again the situation, two things happen. First, there is less food available, so demand supply of food prices go up. Second thing is, those, especially countries like Egypt, but also Ghana, Seychelles, Djibouti, all of a sudden have to purchase their grain from further away. And that has, again, a double impact. First, you have to pay for more days of shipping. You have to charter ships for more days, which is more money. You have to pay more days of shipping. And secondly, just as in food you have demand, supply, and prices go up and down, in shipping also the cost per day of chartering a ship goes up and down with demand and supply. So when we did the previous assessment, we found that half of the increase in the food price after the war in Ukraine started, half was due to transport. And of that half, again half, meaning like about 25%, was due to the additional days of shipping, and the other 25% due to higher costs per day of shipping. I hope that's not too complicated and technical, but it is an attempt to answer your question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you very much, Director Sirimanne. Thank you, everybody, for attending, for the questions. The report is up there. You have it in your inboxes. We have the general overview. We have a general press release. We have spin-offs, 4 regions. Africa was addressed, also Asia and Pacific, also Latin America, and of course, we remain available for any follow-up. Thank you very much.